So, when are you planning to update your will, Margaret? Chloe asked, her voice light, almost playful, as if she were asking about dessert instead of my death, and for a moment, I thought I had misheard her, that the soft glow of the Christmas lights and the hum of familiar carols had somehow distorted her words into something crueler than intended, but when I looked up, her smile was steady, patient, expectant, and I realized she meant every word. I set my fork down carefully beside my plate, the porcelain barely making a sound against the table, and I folded my hands in my lap the way I used to when Daniel was a boy and needed me to listen, really listen, to something he thought mattered. But tonight, he didn't look at me at all, his gaze fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, as if avoiding my eyes might soften the sharpness of what had just been said, and the silence that followed stretched thin across the table, fragile, like glass about to crack. The house looked beautiful, I'll give her that. Chloe always had an eye for presentation. The tree stood tall in the corner, decorated in silver and white, every ornament placed with intention, every ribbon tied just right, and the scent of pine mixed with cinnamon drifted through the air, wrapping the room in something that should have felt warm, comforting, but instead, it felt staged, like a photograph where everyone is smiling just a little too hard. I had spent the morning cooking, the way I always did, roasting the turkey, mashing the potatoes, baking the pies from scratch because store-bought never felt right for Christmas, not in this house, not after 42 years of traditions built with hands that had learned every detail by heart, and as I sat there now, looking at the table I had set, the candles I had lit, I couldn't help but notice how little of it seemed to matter to them. It's just something we should plan ahead, Chloe continued, tilting her head slightly, her tone still gentle, reasonable, as if she were the one being considerate, you know, for tax purposes, to make things easier down the line, and she reached for her glass of wine, taking a small sip, her eyes never leaving mine. Waiting, measuring, calculating. Daniel cleared his throat, a quiet, nervous sound, but he didn't speak, and that, more than anything, told me what I needed to know, because my son, the boy who used to defend me over the smallest things, the man who once promised he would always take care of me the way I had taken care of him, now sat there in silence while his wife discussed my will as if it were a holiday checklist item. I nodded slowly, letting a small smile form on my lips, the kind of smile that doesn't reveal anything, the kind I had learned over years of smoothing over discomfort, of keeping peace where it was easier to stay quiet than to fight, and I picked up my napkin, dabbing the corner of my mouth even though there was nothing there. Of course, I said, my voice steady, softer than I expected, that's something worth talking about. And I watched the subtle shift in Chloe's expression, the flicker of satisfaction she couldn't quite hide, the way her shoulders relaxed just a fraction, as if she had been waiting for resistance and was pleasantly surprised not to find it. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, soft flakes drifting past the window, settling on the dark branches of the trees, and for a moment, I let myself focus on that instead, on the quiet, on the stillness, on something untouched by the conversation happening at my own table. Because it was easier than looking at my son and seeing the distance that had grown there, inch by inch, year by year, so slowly I hadn't noticed until it was too late. I actually brought something tonight, I added after a pause, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, and this time, Daniel did look at me, his brows drawing together slightly, confusion replacing avoidance, while Chloe leaned forward just a little, curiosity sharpening her gaze. You did? She asked. And there was something in her voice now, something more eager, less careful, and I nodded again, letting my smile remain, calm, measured, controlled. Yes, I said, glancing toward the hallway where my coat hung neatly by the door. I thought it might be the right time, and I could feel the shift in the room, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before a storm breaks, when the air changes and everything becomes just a little too still, and as I sat there, surrounded by the decorations, the food, the illusion of a perfect Christmas, I realized something with a clarity that surprised even me. This wasn't a question about my will, it was a test, one they thought I wouldn't notice, one they believed I would pass quietly, obediently, the way I always had, but they had misjudged me, not because I was stronger than before, but because I was finally paying attention, and as I reached for my glass, taking a slow sip, I let the moment settle, let them believe they were in control, because sometimes the most important thing you can do is nothing at all, at least, not right away. I did not reach for my coat right away, even though I had already told them I brought something. Instead I let the moment stretch just a little longer, the way you do when you are watching a scene unfold and you want to understand every expression, every hesitation, every glance that people think goes unnoticed, because those small things, the ones no one plans for, they are always the most honest. Chloe leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping the stem of her wine glass, a habit I had noticed before when she was trying to appear relaxed while waiting for something she wanted, and Daniel shifted slightly beside her, his hand resting on the table but not quite touching hers, as if even that small gesture required more certainty than he currently had. I picked up my fork again and took a small bite of turkey, chewing slowly, deliberately, not because I was hungry, but because I needed the time, needed the quiet rhythm of something ordinary to steady the thoughts that had begun to rearrange themselves inside my mind. For years, I had told myself that distance in a family happens naturally, that children grow up, build their own lives, make their own decisions, and that it is not rejection, it is simply change. But sitting there now, with the question of my will hanging in the air like a misplaced ornament, I could no longer pretend that what I was seeing was ordinary. It had not started tonight, of course, nothing like this ever does. It had been building slowly, quietly, in moments that seemed too small to matter at the time, like the way Chloe would answer questions directed at Daniel, or the way decisions about holidays, about visits, about even the smallest plans, began to shift from conversations into announcements, already decided before I was ever included. I remember the first time I noticed it clearly, about 3 years ago, when Daniel had mentioned they were refinancing their house, and I had asked a simple question about the interest rate, something practical, something I thought a mother could still ask without overstepping, and Chloe had smiled that same controlled smile and said, "We have it handled," as if I were an outsider offering unsolicited advice rather than someone who had spent decades managing a household, balancing budgets, making sure every bill was paid on time. After that, the changes came more quickly, or maybe I just started to see them more clearly. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent, and when they did come over, Chloe always seemed to guide the evening, choosing the topics, steering the conversations, deciding when it was time to leave, and Daniel followed her lead in a way that felt less like agreement and more like quiet surrender. I told myself it was normal, that every marriage creates its own rhythm, its own priorities, and that my role had simply shifted, that I needed to step back, to let them live their lives without interference, because that is what good mothers do. They adjust, they make space, they accept that they are no longer at the center. But there is a difference between stepping back and being moved aside, and somewhere along the way, that line had been crossed so gradually I had not felt it happen. "Mom?" Daniel said now, his voice tentative, pulling me back to the present, and I looked up at him, really looked, noticing the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his shoulders carried a tension that had not been there when he was younger, and for a brief moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would sit at this very table, swinging his legs because they could not yet reach the floor, asking me questions about everything, trusting that I would always have the answers. "You said you brought something," he added, and Chloe turned her head slightly toward him, just enough to acknowledge his words, but her attention remained on me, focused, intent. I set my fork down again, this time with a soft, deliberate finality, and I reached for my glass of water instead of wine, taking a slow sip, letting the coolness settle, grounding me in the present moment. "I did," I said, my voice even, almost gentle, and I let a small pause follow, not long enough to feel theatrical, just long enough to remind them that I was not rushing, that I was not reacting, that whatever this was, it would unfold on my terms. I stood then, smoothing the front of my sweater, a simple cream color that Chloe had once complimented for being timeless, a word that I had come to understand could mean many things depending on who was using it, and I walked toward the hallway, my steps steady, unhurried, aware of their eyes following me, of the shift in the room as anticipation replaced certainty. My coat hung exactly where I had left it, the fabric still holding a trace of the cold air from outside, and I reached into the inside pocket, my fingers brushing against the envelope I had placed there earlier that afternoon, long before the candles were lit, long before the table was set, long before Chloe asked her carefully worded question. I paused for a moment, just long enough to feel the weight of it in my hand, not heavy in the way people expect something important to be, but solid, real, undeniable, and then I turned back toward the dining room, toward the table, toward the two people who believed they understood exactly how this evening would go. And I walked back in with the same calm expression I had worn all night, the same quiet smile, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let others believe they are still one step ahead, even when they are not. I placed the envelope gently on the table in front of Chloe, not sliding it across like something casual, but setting it down with care, as if it deserved its own space, its own moment, and for a second. No one moved, not even Chloe, whose confidence had carried her so easily through the evening until now, and I could see the faint hesitation in her eyes, the brief flicker of uncertainty that comes when something does not follow the expected script. "Go ahead," I said softly, pulling my chair back and sitting down again, folding my hands once more in my lap, the same composed posture I had held all night, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze shifting between the envelope and my face, as if trying to read something there, some clue about what was about to happen, but I gave him nothing, just the same calm expression, the same quiet patience. Chloe reached for the envelope then, her movements controlled, deliberate, but not as effortless as before, and she glanced at Daniel for the briefest moment before opening it, as if seeking reassurance, and he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough for her to proceed. The room felt different now, the warmth of the lights no longer comforting, the soft music playing in the background suddenly distant, like it belonged to another house, another evening, and I sat there, watching, not with anger, not with anticipation, but with a clarity that had taken me years to find. She slid the papers out slowly, her fingers pausing just slightly as she caught the first glimpse of what was written there, and I saw it in her face before she said anything, the confusion, the way her brows drew together, the way her lips parted just enough to let out a quiet breath she did not intend to make audible. "What is this?" she asked finally, her voice still controlled, but no longer light, no longer playful, and Daniel leaned closer, trying to see, his shoulder brushing against hers now, a gesture of alignment that felt instinctive, practiced, as if they had stood on the same side of many conversations before this one. "It is a record," I replied, my tone even, almost gentle, as if I were explaining something simple, something obvious, and I reached for my water again, taking a small sip before continuing, giving her the time to turn the first page, to let the words settle in. "A record of expenses, contributions, and support. Over the past 30 years, I said, and I watched as her eyes moved across the lines, the numbers, the dates, each one carefully documented, each one tied to a memory I had carried quietly, never expecting to present them like this, never imagining that they would one day need to be accounted for. Daniel frowned, his hand moving to steady the edge of the paper as he read alongside her, and I could see the moment recognition began to form, not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle him, enough to make him shift in his seat, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer detached. "This cannot be serious," Chloe said, a hint of sharpness slipping into her voice despite her effort to maintain composure, and she looked up at me then, directly, no longer measuring, no longer calculating, but searching, trying to understand how the conversation had turned, how the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. I met her gaze steadily, not challenging, not defensive, simply present, and I let a small silence follow, the kind that does not demand attention but holds it anyway. "You asked about my will," I said after a moment, my voice calm, unwavering, and I thought it might be helpful to review what has already been given, and Daniel sat back slightly, his eyes moving between us, the tension in his shoulders tightening, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and something deeper, something harder to name. Chloe let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it, only disbelief, and she flipped through another page, then another, faster now, as if speed might change what she was seeing, as if moving quickly could restore control, but the numbers remained, the details remained, the quiet accumulation of years that had gone unnoticed until now. "This is not how this works," she said, her voice firmer, more certain, as if reclaiming authority through tone alone, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her words without agreeing to them. "Perhaps not," I said, "but it is how this conversation began," and I rested my hands lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the present, in the reality of the moment that had been a long time coming, even if I had not known it at the start of the evening. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from years ago, from moments when he felt overwhelmed but did not yet know how to respond, and for a brief second, I saw that boy again, the one who used to look to me for guidance, for answers, and I wondered, quietly, when that instinct had been replaced, when silence had become his default instead of trust. "Mom," he began, his voice uncertain, and I looked at him, giving him my full attention, the same way I always had, the same way I always would, but I did not interrupt, I did not fill the space for him, because some things need to be said without help, without direction, and as the seconds passed, he did not finish the sentence, the words lingering somewhere just out of reach. I let the silence settle again, not heavy, not oppressive, just present, and I realized then that nothing in this moment needed to be rushed, not their understanding, not their reaction, not even what would come next, because for the first time in a very long time, I was not trying to keep the peace, I was simply allowing the truth to exist in the room, exactly as it was. Chloe did not look up right away, and that told me more than anything she could have said, because people who are certain, truly certain, do not need time to process, they respond immediately, confidently, but she kept her eyes on the pages, turning them more slowly now, as if each line required a little more attention than the last, and Daniel sat beside her, his expression tightening with every second that passed, his silence no longer neutral, but heavy, conflicted, uncertain. "These are just numbers," Chloe said finally, though her voice lacked the ease it had earlier, and she placed the papers back on the table, aligning them carefully as if neatness could restore control. "This does not have anything to do with what we were talking about," and she leaned back slightly, her posture straightening, her tone sharpening just enough to reassert herself. I nodded once, acknowledging her words without agreeing, and I let my gaze drift briefly to the tree in the corner, its light steady, unwavering, a quiet contrast to the shifting energy at the table. "You are right," I said calmly, "they are just numbers," and I paused, letting the simplicity of that statement settle before continuing. "But numbers have a way of telling stories, especially when people choose not to listen to the one spoken out loud." Daniel shifted in his chair again, his hand resting against his forehead now, as if trying to piece together something that had been overlooked, something that had always been there but never fully acknowledged. "Mom, I did not ask you to keep track of things like this," he said, his voice low, careful, and I turned to him, meeting his eyes with the same steady calm I had held all evening. "No, you did not," I replied, "and I never expected you to," and I let a small breath out, not a sigh, just a quiet release of something that had been held for a long time. "That is the nature of giving, Daniel. It is not supposed to be recorded, it is not supposed to be repaid, it is simply done because you love someone and you want to make their life easier." Chloe crossed her arms then, a subtle shift, but one that carried meaning, a quiet defense forming where confidence had once been, and she tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal that she was no longer trying to appear agreeable. "Exactly," she said, her voice firm, "so I do not understand why you are bringing this up now," and for a moment, I considered her question, not because I needed an answer, but because it deserved one, even if she was not asking it with the intention of truly hearing it. "Because tonight, you asked me to reduce my life to a document," I said, my voice still even, still composed, "a will, something that lists what remains after I am gone, something that assigns value to what I leave behind," and I rested my hands lightly on the table again, feeling the familiar surface beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the present moment. "So I thought it might be fair to also look at what has already been given, what has already been transferred, not in legal terms, but in real ones," I continued, and I watched as Daniel lowered his hand, his gaze returning to the papers, to the numbers, to the quiet evidence of years that had never been discussed in this way before. "This is not fair," Chloe said quickly, almost too quickly, and there was a sharpness now that she could no longer fully conceal. "You cannot compare past support to future inheritance, those are completely different things," and she leaned forward slightly, as if pressing her point could re-establish the ground she felt slipping away. I held her gaze without resistance, without challenge, simply steady, and I inclined my head just slightly. "You are right again," I said, and this time, there was the faintest hint of something else in my tone, not sarcasm, not anger, but clarity. "They are different, one is given freely, without expectation, and the other is being requested in advance, with very clear expectations attached." The room grew quieter after that, not in an abrupt way, but in a gradual settling, like snow continuing to fall outside, soft, steady, inevitable, and Daniel looked between us, his expression shifting again, uncertainty giving way to something more reflective, something heavier. "Mom, we were just trying to plan ahead," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, less certain than before, and I nodded, acknowledging the intention behind his words even if I no longer accepted them at face value. "I understand that," I replied, "and planning ahead is important," and I let a small pause follow, not to create tension, but to allow space for what needed to be said next. but planning should not come at the cost of respect, and it should not begin with the assumption that what belongs to someone else is already yours to organize. Chloe looked at Daniel then, a quick glance, searching, perhaps, for alignment, for reassurance, but he did not immediately respond, and that hesitation, small as it was, shifted something in the room more than any words could have. I reached for my glass again, taking another sip of water, the motion calm, unhurried, and I set it back down with the same quiet precision. "This is not about money," I said finally, my voice steady, grounded. It never was. And I let that statement stand on its own, without elaboration, without justification, because the truth, when spoken clearly, does not need to be explained, it only needs to be heard. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt full, as if every word that had been said was still lingering in the air, settling slowly around us, and for the first time that evening, Chloe did not immediately respond. She simply sat there, her arms still crossed, her posture held in place by something that was no longer confidence, and Daniel remained quiet beside her, his eyes drifting once more to the papers on the table, not scanning them now, not analyzing, just looking, as if seeing them differently than he had a few minutes ago. I let that silence remain, not out of hesitation, but because it had a purpose, because sometimes the most important shifts do not happen through more words, but through the space left behind after them. It reminded me of something my husband used to say, that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think the conversation is over, when they believe there is nothing left to defend or explain, and I had learned, over many years, to recognize those moments, to wait for them, to observe rather than interrupt. "So what exactly are you trying to say?" Chloe asked at last, her voice measured again, but no longer smooth, no longer effortless, and she leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting on the edge of the table, closer to the papers now, as if proximity might give her back some sense of control. I met her gaze without urgency, without resistance, simply steady, and I allowed myself a small breath before answering, not because I needed to gather my thoughts, but because I wanted to choose them carefully. "I am saying that value is not something that begins at the end of a life," I replied, my tone calm, almost reflective. "It is something that builds over time, in ways that are often invisible, in ways that are rarely acknowledged unless someone decides to measure it." Daniel shifted again, his chair making the faintest sound against the floor, and he glanced at Chloe before looking back at me, his expression uncertain, searching, as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of the same situation, the one he had accepted and the one now being placed in front of him. "We were not trying to be disrespectful," he said quietly, and I nodded, because I believed that, at least in part, he was telling the truth, not the whole truth, but enough of it to matter. "I know," I said, and there was no accusation in my voice, only acknowledgement. "But intent does not erase impact, Daniel, and sometimes what we believe is practical can still be deeply personal to someone else." Chloe exhaled sharply, not quite a sigh, more like a release of tension she had been holding back, and she uncrossed her arms, reaching for her glass again, though she did not drink from it, she only held it, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem. "You are making this more emotional than it needs to be," she said, and there was a trace of impatience now, a subtle edge that had not been there at the beginning of the evening. "This is about planning, about being responsible, about making sure things are handled properly," and she set the glass back down with a controlled motion, her eyes returning to mine with renewed focus. I listened to her without interruption, allowing her words to settle, to reveal themselves fully, and then I inclined my head just slightly, acknowledging the structure of her argument even as I saw the gaps within it. "Responsibility is important," I agreed, my voice steady, "but it should not come at the expense of relationship," and I paused briefly, not to emphasize the point, but to let it exist without competition, because when responsibility becomes a reason to overlook the person involved, it stops being responsible, and it starts being convenient. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if something within him had shifted, not entirely, not yet, but enough to change the way he was sitting, the way he was listening, and he looked down at the table again, at the papers, at the quiet evidence of a history he had lived but never examined in this way. "I did not realize," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, more reflective than defensive, and he did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to, because sometimes recognition does not require full articulation, it only requires presence. Chloe turned her head toward him quickly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction, and for a brief moment, the dynamic between them shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not paying attention, but enough for me to notice, enough for me to understand that this conversation was no longer moving in a direction she could fully control. I sat there quietly, my hands resting lightly against the table, feeling the steady surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in the moment, in the calm that had replaced the uncertainty I might have felt before, and I realized that this was not about winning an argument, it was not about proving a point, it was about allowing something to be seen clearly, without distortion, without avoidance, without the quiet assumptions that had shaped so many of our interactions over the years. There are things we do for each other in a family that are never meant to be counted, I said finally, my voice gentle but firm, but when those same relationships begin to revolve around what is owed, what is expected, what is already being planned for before its time, then something has already changed, and I let that thought settle between us, not as a conclusion, but as an opening, as something that did not need to be answered immediately, only understood over time. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the ground in a quiet layer that made everything look untouched, and inside, at the table I had set with care, with habit, with years of tradition behind it, I felt a different kind of stillness take hold, not the kind that comes from avoidance, but the kind that comes from clarity, from finally seeing something as it truly is, even if it is not what you once believed it to be. Daniel did not speak for a while after that, and I could see the shift happening slowly, not like a sudden realization, but like something settling into place, piece by piece, the kind of understanding that takes hold quietly before it ever becomes words, and he leaned back in his chair, his hands resting flat against his thighs now, as if grounding himself in something more stable than the conversation that had been moving around him all evening. Chloe, on the other hand, did not allow that same stillness to take hold. She adjusted in her seat again, her movements sharper now, less controlled, and she reached for the papers once more, flipping back to the first page as if trying to find something she had missed, something that would restore the balance she had expected when she first asked her question. "This is unnecessary," she said, and there was no softness left in her voice now, only a firm insistence. "We are talking about the future, not the past, and you are turning it into something it does not need to be," and she tapped lightly on the top sheet with her finger, a small, precise gesture that carried more tension than she likely intended. I watched her for a moment, not with judgment, not with frustration, but with the same quiet attention I had been giving everything else that evening, and I realized that what she was reacting to was not the numbers, not even the implication behind them, but the loss of certainty, the realization that the conversation was no longer unfolding in a way she could anticipate or guide. "The future does not exist without the past," I said gently, my voice steady, almost conversational, "and the past does not disappear simply because we choose not to acknowledge it," and I let my gaze shift briefly to Daniel again, because this was not only about her, it was about him as well, about the space he had occupied between us for so long without ever fully stepping into it. He looked up at me then, his expression different now, less guarded, more open, though still uncertain, and I could see the questions forming behind his eyes, not yet spoken, but no longer avoided. "Did you really keep track of all of this?" he asked quietly, and there was something in his tone that had not been there before, not defensiveness, not dismissal, but something closer to recognition, to curiosity, and I nodded once, not as a confirmation of the numbers themselves, but of what they represented. "Not at the time," I said, "not in the way it looks on paper," and I allowed a small pause before continuing, "but over the years, certain things stay with you, not because you are keeping score, but because they mattered when they happened, and eventually, those moments form a pattern, whether you intend them to or not." Chloe let out a small, incredulous breath, shaking her head slightly as if rejecting the premise entirely, and she pushed the papers a few inches away from her, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional one she was trying to establish. "This is exactly what I mean," she said, her voice tightening again. "You are turning normal family support into something transactional, something calculated, and that is not fair," and she leaned back once more, crossing her arms again, a familiar posture returning, but this time it felt less like control and more like resistance. I considered her words carefully, not because they unsettled me, but because they revealed something important about how she understood the situation, how she framed it in her own mind, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the surface of her argument while looking beyond it. "It would be unfair," I agreed, "if this were about repayment," and I let that distinction settle before continuing, "but it is not," and I rested my hands lightly against the table again, my fingers relaxed, my posture unchanged, because nothing about this moment required urgency. This is about awareness, I said, about understanding what has already been given before asking for what has not yet been offered, and I watched as Daniel's gaze dropped once more to the papers, his eyes moving slowly across the lines, not searching for specific numbers now, but absorbing the weight of them, the accumulation of years that had never been presented in this way before. The room felt quieter again, not in a tense way, but in a focused one, as if the conversation had narrowed to something more precise, something that no longer needed to expand in multiple directions. Outside, the snow had begun to settle more thickly, covering the ground in a smooth, uninterrupted layer, and the faint reflection of the Christmas lights shimmered against the window, steady and unchanged, even as everything inside the room had shifted. "I did not think it mattered this much to you," Daniel said after a moment, his voice low, almost reflective, and I looked at him, really looked, seeing not just the man he had become, but the distance he had traveled to get there, the choices he had made, the ones he had avoided, and I felt something settle within me, not disappointment, not regret, but a quiet clarity that had taken a long time to arrive. "It did not," I replied, my tone gentle, honest, "not until tonight," and I let that truth stand on its own, without embellishment, without explanation, because it did not need either. Chloe glanced at him again, quickly, as if measuring his reaction, and then back at me, her expression more guarded now, less certain, and for the first time since the conversation began, she did not immediately respond, she simply sat there, absorbing, recalibrating, and I realized that this was the moment where everything could still go in different directions, where nothing had been finalized, nothing had been decided, but something fundamental had already changed, something that could not be undone simply by returning to the way things had been before. No one reached for the food anymore, even though the plates were still half full and the candles continued to burn steadily at the center of the table, their small flames unwavering in a room that no longer felt as composed as it looked, and I noticed the way Daniel's gaze lingered on the envelope, then shifted to Chloe, then back to me, as if he were trying to locate himself within the conversation, trying to decide where he stood now that the ground had changed beneath him. Chloe sat very still, her posture controlled but no longer relaxed, and she adjusted the sleeve of her blouse with a small, precise movement that seemed less about comfort and more about regaining a sense of order, of structure, something predictable in a moment that had become anything but. "So what happens now?" she asked finally, her voice quieter than before, but not softer, just more measured, as if each word was being placed carefully, tested before it was allowed to settle in the space between us. I considered the question, not because I needed time to answer, but because it deserved more than a reaction, it deserved clarity, and I rested my hands lightly on the table once more, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in the present, in the simplicity of what needed to be said next. "That depends," I replied calmly, "on what you both thought was going to happen tonight," and I let my gaze move between them, not lingering on either one for too long, but not avoiding either of them either, because this was not a conversation meant for one person alone. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering again, and he leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the edge of the table, a posture that felt more engaged than anything he had shown earlier in the evening. "We were just trying to be prepared," he said, his voice steady but subdued. "We thought it would be responsible to understand things ahead of time," and I nodded, acknowledging the intention behind his words, even as I recognized how incomplete they were. "Prepared for what?" I asked gently, not as a challenge, but as a question that needed to be answered fully, and he hesitated, just for a moment, before responding. "For the future," he said, and the words hung there, simple, familiar, but suddenly lacking the certainty they might have carried before. Chloe straightened slightly at that, as if the answer aligned with her expectations, and she added, "That is what people do, Margaret, they plan, they make sure everything is in order, so there are no complications later," and her tone carried a quiet insistence again, though it no longer held the same authority it had at the beginning of the evening. I listened to them both, allowing their words to settle, to reveal themselves fully, and then I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the structure of their reasoning while seeing the space it had overlooked. "Planning is not the issue," I said, my voice even, composed. "It is the assumption behind the planning that matters," and I paused briefly, not to create tension, but to allow the distinction to exist clearly before continuing. "When planning begins with the expectation that something already belongs to you, even if it has not been given, it stops being preparation and becomes entitlement," and I watched as Daniel's expression shifted again, his gaze dropping momentarily before returning to mine, the recognition in his eyes more defined now, more difficult to ignore. Chloe's lips pressed together slightly, a subtle reaction, but one that spoke to the resistance she was still holding onto, and she leaned back once more, her arms crossing again, though this time it felt less like control and more like defense. "That is not what we meant," she said, her voice firm, but quieter than before, as if she were choosing her words more carefully now, aware that the conversation no longer followed a predictable path. I nodded once, acknowledging her statement without contradicting it, because intention and perception are rarely the same thing, and both can exist at once without canceling each other out. "I understand that," I said, "but meaning something and creating an impact are not always the same," and I let a small silence follow, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just present, giving space for that idea to settle. Daniel ran a hand through his hair again, a familiar gesture, one I had seen countless times when he was younger, when he was trying to work through something he did not yet fully understand, and he looked down at the table, at the papers, at the quiet accumulation of years that had been placed in front of him, and for the first time, he did not look away immediately. "I think we rushed this," he said after a moment, his voice low, almost thoughtful, and Chloe turned toward him quickly, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to assess how far his thinking had shifted, how much ground had been lost or gained in a conversation that had not gone the way she expected. I did not respond right away, not because I disagreed or agreed, but because the statement itself marked something important, a movement, a shift, however small, and I allowed it to exist without interruption. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the driveway, the yard, the quiet street beyond, softening every edge, creating a stillness that felt almost separate from everything happening inside the house, and I found myself noticing the contrast, the way the world outside seemed untouched while everything inside had changed. "Nothing needs to be decided tonight," I said finally, my voice calm, steady, not about the future, not about anything else, and I let my gaze rest on Daniel for a moment longer before continuing, "But some things do need to be understood," and I did not elaborate, I did not list them, because understanding is not something that can be handed to someone fully formed, it has to be reached, piece by piece, through moments like this, through conversations that do not follow expectations, through silence that says more than words ever could, and as I sat there, in the quiet glow of the Christmas lights, I realized that whatever came next would not be decided by what was written on paper, but by what they chose to see clearly now that it had finally been placed in front of them. The room did not return to normal after that, even though no one raised their voice, even though nothing had been broken or overturned, because some changes do not announce themselves loudly, they settle quietly, altering everything without needing permission, and I could see it in the way Daniel sat now, no longer leaning toward Chloe for direction, no longer waiting for her to respond first, but sitting back, thinking, processing, his attention divided in a way it had not been earlier in the evening. Chloe noticed it too, I could tell by the way her posture adjusted again, more subtle this time, less controlled, and she reached for her glass but did not lift it, her fingers resting against the stem as if she needed something to hold onto, something steady in a conversation that had slipped beyond her expectations. "This does not change anything," she said after a moment, her voice quieter but firm, as if repetition might restore certainty. "We still need to talk about what happens next," and she looked directly at me, her gaze steady, searching for something she could anchor herself to. I met her eyes without resistance, without challenge, simply present, and I let a small pause follow, not as a tactic, but as a reflection of the space that now existed between what had been assumed and what was now understood. "You are right," I said calmly, "it does not change everything," and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her point before continuing, "but it changes enough," and I let those words settle, not expanding on them immediately, because sometimes the impact of a statement lies in what is left unsaid. Daniel shifted again, his hands now resting flat against the table, and he looked at me with a focus that had not been there before, as if he were finally seeing the conversation for what it was rather than what he had expected it to be. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice steady but quieter, and I turned to him, giving him my full attention, because this was the moment where understanding could take root if it was allowed to. "I mean that what happens next should not be decided from a place of assumption," I replied, my tone even, grounded. "It should come from clarity, from respect, from an understanding of what this relationship actually is, not just what it is expected to provide," and I watched as his expression shifted again, not fully resolved, but moving, changing, opening in a way it had not been before. Chloe exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly, and she glanced at Daniel, then back at me, as if recalculating, adjusting her approach to a situation that no longer followed the path she had planned. "We are not trying to take anything from you," she said, her voice softer now, though still controlled. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly," and there was something in her tone that suggested she believed this was a reasonable position, something that should be accepted without further complication. I listened to her carefully, allowing her words to exist without interruption, and then I inclined my head once more, acknowledging the intention behind them while recognizing the space they did not address. "Handling things properly includes timing," I said, my voice calm, steady, "and it includes understanding when something is yours to handle and when it is not," and I let my gaze rest on her for a moment longer, not as a challenge, but as a simple statement of presence. The clock on the wall ticked softly in the background, marking the passage of time in a way that felt more noticeable now, as if each second carried more weight than it had before, and I became aware of how long we had been sitting there, how much had shifted without anyone raising their voice or leaving the table. Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly, a small, absent gesture, and then he looked at the papers again, this time reaching for them, pulling them slightly closer, not to push them away, but to examine them more carefully, and that, more than anything else, told me that something had changed. Chloe watched him do it, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, and she straightened in her chair, her posture regaining some of its earlier structure, though it no longer carried the same certainty. "Daniel," she said quietly, as if reminding him of something, as if calling him back to a position he had occupied before, but he did not immediately respond, his attention still on the pages, on the quiet accumulation of years that had been laid out in front of him. I did not speak during that moment, I did not fill the space, because it did not belong to me, it belonged to him, to whatever he was beginning to see, to whatever he was starting to understand without being told. Outside, the snow had settled into a thick, even layer, covering the driveway completely now, softening the edges of everything it touched, and inside, the glow of the Christmas lights reflected faintly against the window, steady and unchanged, even as everything else had shifted. "I think we need to slow down," Daniel said finally, his voice measured, thoughtful, and he looked up at Chloe as he spoke, not avoiding her gaze, not deferring to it, but meeting it directly, and for the first time that evening, there was something in his expression that felt independent, something that did not rely on her for direction. Chloe held his gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then she nodded once, slowly, though it was not clear whether she was agreeing with him or simply acknowledging that the conversation had moved beyond her control. I sat there quietly, my hands resting against the table, my posture unchanged, and I realized that nothing more needed to be said right now, not because there was nothing left to discuss, but because the most important part had already begun, the part where understanding takes shape without being forced, where people begin to see what has always been there but never fully recognized, and as the silence settled once more, calm and steady, I allowed it to remain, knowing that this, more than anything else, was where real change begins. The quiet that settled after Daniel spoke did not feel uncertain anymore, it felt resolved in a way that did not require immediate agreement, and I could see it in the way he remained seated, not shifting, not avoiding, simply present in the moment he had just created, and for the first time that evening, the conversation no longer felt like something being managed, it felt like something being understood. Chloe did not respond right away, and that hesitation, small as it was, carried more weight than any argument she could have made, because it meant she was no longer certain of the direction, no longer guiding the outcome, and she glanced briefly at the papers once more before looking back at Daniel, as if deciding whether to press forward or step back. I watched them both quietly, my hands still resting lightly on the table, my posture unchanged, because there was nothing left for me to push, nothing left to prove, the shift had already happened, and it did not belong to me anymore, it belonged to them. "Maybe we did rush," Chloe said finally, her voice measured, careful, and though the words echoed what Daniel had said earlier, they did not carry the same tone, they felt more like a concession than a realization, but even that mattered, even that marked a change. Daniel nodded slightly, not looking at her this time, but at the table, at the envelope, at everything that had been laid out in front of him, and he reached for the papers again, this time not with hesitation, but with intention, gathering them together neatly before placing them back inside the envelope, as if acknowledging that they were not something to be dismissed or ignored. "We can talk about this another time," he said quietly, and when he looked up at me, there was something different in his expression, not fully resolved, not entirely clear, but present in a way it had not been before, and I recognized it for what it was, the beginning of awareness, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but unfolds gradually, over time. I inclined my head slightly, accepting his words without adding to them, because this was not a moment that needed to be extended, it was one that needed to be allowed to settle, to exist without pressure. Chloe sat back in her chair, her posture less rigid now, though not relaxed, and she adjusted her hands in her lap, no longer reaching for the glass, no longer tapping her fingers, simply still, as if recalibrating to a new understanding she had not anticipated when the evening began. The clock continued its steady rhythm on the wall, marking time in quiet, consistent beats, and I became aware again of the house around us, the decorations, the lights, the food that had gone mostly untouched, all of it still in place, unchanged, even though the meaning of the evening had shifted entirely. I reached forward then, not for the papers, not for the conversation, but for the small plate in front of me, moving it slightly to the side, a simple, ordinary action that signaled something without needing to say it, and I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my sweater once more, the same calm motion I had made earlier, the same quiet control. "I think that is enough for tonight," I said, my voice gentle, not dismissive, not final, just clear, and neither of them argued, neither of them tried to extend the conversation, which told me more than anything else could have. Daniel nodded again, more firmly this time, and he pushed his chair back slightly, not standing, but shifting in a way that suggested he understood the moment had reached its natural end. Chloe remained seated for a second longer, then followed, rising with a composed movement that had returned, though it no longer carried the same certainty it had earlier in the evening. I walked toward the kitchen without urgency, gathering a few plates, stacking them carefully, the familiar routine grounding me in something steady, something unchanged, and I could hear them behind me, quiet, not speaking, not filling the space with unnecessary words, and that silence felt different now, not strained, not controlled, just present. As I placed the dishes by the sink, I paused for a moment, looking out the window at the snow that had fully covered the yard, smooth and undisturbed, reflecting the soft glow of the lights inside, and I allowed myself a small breath, not of relief, not of victory, but of clarity, because this had never been about winning, it had been about seeing, about allowing something that had been overlooked to finally be acknowledged. When I turned back, they were standing near the table, Daniel holding the envelope loosely in his hand, Chloe beside him, both of them quieter than when they had arrived, and I met their gaze once more, not with expectation, not with judgment, simply with presence. "Good night," I said, my voice steady, and Daniel stepped forward slightly, as if he might say something more, but then he stopped, the words not quite forming, and instead, he nodded again, a small, deliberate gesture that carried more meaning than anything he could have added. Chloe gave a brief nod as well, her expression composed, though less certain, and they turned toward the door together, moving without urgency, without the easy confidence they had carried earlier, but not with conflict either, just with something quieter, something more reflective. I watched as they gathered their coats, as Daniel opened the door, letting in a brief rush of cold air, and as they stepped out into the snow, their figures fading slightly against the white-covered ground, and when the door closed behind them, the house returned to its stillness, the same stillness it had held before, but now it felt different, not empty, not lonely, just clear. I turned off the lights one by one, leaving only the tree glowing softly in the corner, and I stood there for a moment, looking at it, at the reflection of everything that had happened, and I realized that nothing had been taken from me that night, nothing had been lost, but something had been returned, something I had not realized I had given away over the years, and as I walked upstairs, my steps steady, unhurried, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by expectation or assumption, but by choice, and for the first time in a very long time, that choice belonged entirely to me.